So I'm Ken Montero. I'm the general counsel at the Ford Foundation, also a board member. This is my last board meeting at Philanthropy New York. So it is my pleasure to introduce the next panel. Can we have the panelists come out? This panel is entitled Technology and Civic Engagement. And we have three terrific leaders who will come at the topic of civic innovation from very different perspectives. They're going to talk about different definitions of civic tech and how it is being employed. And hopefully they'll engage you with your questions at some point during the panel. Please make sure you read their bios in the material you've received. They have very detailed and very impressive bios. But let me introduce them, starting from the far end, our moderator, Andrew Rasiej. Andrew is the founder and CEO of Civic Hall, a community space where social entrepreneurs, change makers, government employees, hackers, academics, journalists, and artists can share knowledge, build tools, and solve problems together. He is also the founder of Personal Democracy Media, which produces Personal Democracy Forum and other events at the intersection of technology and politics, and is the co-founder of MideastWire.com, which translates Arabic and Farsi news and opinion into English. In the center, we have Jessica Reeves, who is the Chief Operating Officer at VOTO Latino, a civic media organization that uses innovative digital media campaigns, pop culture, and grassroots voices to provide culturally relevant programs that engage, educate, and empower Latinos to be agents of change. Before coming to VOTO Latino, she helped launch award-winning digital and social media marketing campaigns for brands like Kraft, Twix, and Domino's Pizza. And then closest to me, we have Fahad Ahmed, who is the executive director of DRUM, Desis Rising, Up, and Moving, a multi-generational membership-led organization of low-wage South Asian and Indo-Caribbean immigrant workers and youth in New York City. He was a recipient of the Haywood Burns Fellowship from the National Lawyers Guild and served as an Ella Baker intern at the Center for Constitutional Rights. So welcome to all of you, Andrew, and I think you're going to lead us off.
Thank you very much. So I heard just before I got on that because we're on Twitter and using a hashtag that Donald Trump is now following this conference. So we have his attention. But more importantly, we want you to know that besides having a couple of great panelists to talk a little bit about the intersection of technology and civic engagement, we're going to open this up to as much audience participation as possible. So we're going to speak for about 30 minutes and cover some topics that we talked about a little bit before we got together here on stage, and then we'll open it up, so there'll be lots of time for questions and interaction. I'm going to first allow my panelists to go a little further into their bios than what was just offered to us by our hosts, and maybe add a minute or two about themselves in relation to this topic or how their organization thinks about this topic, and then I'll ask a couple of questions. So with that, Jessica, please.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. How's everybody doing?
Great.
This is the end of the day. Oh, that's pretty energetic. Great. Thank you so much for having me here. As folks heard, I'm Jessica Reeves, CEO at VOTO Latino. And funny enough, I was just mentioning I'm coming up on my 8th year at VOTO Latino. So been through a couple of election cycles, been through a couple of different projects and campaigns, but what I really love about VOTO Latino and what keeps me there is we're a organization made up of the community that we serve, for the community that we serve, and really, really focus on engaging young Latinos through technology, media, and pop culture. And that ranges, we have a number of different ways we do that through not only civic engagement, voter registration, GeoTV campaigns, but we found after the first few years that it takes ongoing engagement, ongoing education, and really, really connecting issue advocacy to elected officials, to how to be agents of change, how to make that change in your community. So have been fortunate enough to work on a number of our issue advocacy campaigns, but also at the end of the day found that empowering young leaders, empowering young Latinos with the tools and technologies that they need is the way that we move forward. And in this country right now, I think for us, the 2016 election was particularly painful, but the strategy that we've had, that we've always had, I think holds true and is even more important now than ever. The progressive movement and our folks are not going to win with this 50% plus one strategy. It can't be about engaging just enough people, about getting just enough folks involved, represented. It's really, really about expanding the electorate and getting absolutely every voice heard. And for me, getting to be at an organization that is creative about it and makes it fun is really what keeps me there. And a big part of that is technology, which I'll get to talk a little bit about more later. But
Fahad?
Good afternoon. My name is Fahad. I've been with Drum for about 18 years. And I came to the organization because I was myself an undocumented immigrant for about 7 or 8 years, came from a low-income family, and the combination of those things produces marginalization in many, many ways, from education, from employment, from now apparent access to technology, and many other things. We are a membership-based organization of about 4,000 members, and that's the reality for most of them. They are immigrants, they are low-wage workers, so they're cab drivers, street vendors, work in McDonald's, or the children of people that work those jobs, domestic workers. And many of them are limited in English proficiency. Many of them are also limited in technological use, although they figure out ways to work around that, which we'll talk about more. And then a majority of them are undocumented, at least 65%. And so civic engagement, if it's limited to the notion of being able to vote, is not enough for them. But they are very actively involved in their communities and beyond their communities, alongside other communities or in the landscape of the city and even federally. And so, being invited to this panel, it was like, are you sure you want me to talk about this? Are you sure you have the right person? But I think really appreciated that the invite was around like sort of how do we push beyond these notions around how technology is used, how civic engagement is defined, to really figure out, to really base our frameworks on the realities of people, rather than kind of creating a framework first and then figuring out how people fit into it.
Great. So a little bit of framing for you all before we dig into the questions. And I'll share with you sort of from my perspective, having been in this field for almost 20 years, that there's an incredible amount of excitement around the field of civic tech or technology for civics. But the terms that often get used to sort of describe some of that excitement are a little different, and it's important to sort of separate them. So there's civic tech, there's gov tech, there's smart city tech, and there's an awful lot of promise and opportunity. There are some dangers too. But without knowing the different definitions of those three things, as where they overlap and where they separate, I think is very important to this discussion. So a quick primer. Civic tech is any technology for the public good, full stop. It can't be hijacked easily to be used for a nefarious purpose. It's usually open source technology. It can easily be adopted. It can be audited. It can be made accountable. GovTech, which often is designed to support the government delivering to the public what we think are public goods, in the public interest, often can be, but maybe not. So just as a quick show of hands, how many of you wouldn't be surprised to learn that there's a technology company right now working with the Department of Homeland Security using AI to just try to figure out where 1,100 undocumented people are hiding in America? So, or would you be surprised if you learned that the police department has a technology that allows them to check the social media profiles of African Americans before they knock on their windows when they pull them on the side of the road to see if they tweeted about Black Lives Matter? In fact, how many of you had read a terms of service all the way through and before you clicked agree? The last one's urban tech and smart city tech. There's also a lot of promises there. Boy, it'd be great, right? I'm not going to use Uber as an example, but let's say it's Juno, since they give a higher rate of return for their drivers. Your Juno will be waiting for you outside. The meal, the perfect meal will be waiting for you, delivered for you at your home. The tickets to the opera where you'd like to sit are waiting for you even before you knew your favorite show was going to be showing at the Met. The promise of IoT creating a more efficient and a better city there's an awful lot of hype, but how much agency do underserved communities have over the deployment of these technologies? What data is being collected? What accounting mechanisms are there to make sure that that data, as it's collected, is used only for for equitable purposes? And as we're talking about all this, the technology keeps evolving and changing and moving faster and faster. The digital divide is greater than it was even 20 years ago when people were just trying to get online. So with that broad spectrum of perspective, we'll dig into some questions about how our guests use these technologies and how it relates to the potential of expanding the idea of civic engagement. So we'll start with you, Jessica. So just a little bit, how does your organization actually currently use technology? And how does it relate to the way, traditional organizing, from, let's call it pre-digital era organizing today?
So that's a great question. So for us, there was no pre-digital era. VOTO Latino was about 14 years old, started digital first at the beginning because it was cheaper, and because our co-founders, that's the way that they communicated with their family and friends. So saw this opportunity to take those strategies and take those ideas and reach out to other people like them. We were one of the first organizations, the first civic organization to focus on English-speaking, English-dominant Latinos through technology and media. I was actually at a recent presentation. We were talking about the 2020 census and pulled up some old, if you want a quick laugh, pull up Google CNN, VOTO Latino 2010 census. Going through the new technologies back then, where we were talking to people on MySpace and this new platform, Facebook, and texting everybody on their phones, on their flip phones. So not exactly, I think, the best strategy at that time, but a really great way to really look at innovating and disproving, I think, these ideas that people of color back then were not online, were not engaging. They're actually first early adopters of all these technologies, a lot of times out of necessity. A lot of people in communities of color don't have landlines at all. So when you talk about polling, when you talk about gathering this data, they are accessing the internet through their mobile phones. It's also their main line of communication. So always having that at the forefront of our work has been our main strategy. But in terms of what we're doing nowadays, I think that we were talking a little bit earlier about some issues with, especially in this last election, with security. For VOTO Latino, we have been working on voter modernization projects for a number of years. And I think that what happened in the last election is a huge example of it doesn't matter if our folks are not using online technologies to register to vote. There are still security issues. How we meet them and how we deal with them is a different story. But for us, working towards voter modernization, we launched in 2016 an app called Voter Pal that scans a driver's license. Oops, sorry about that. I'll put this over here. Scans the driver's license to auto-populate a voter registration form. Because when you're talking about all the access that we have to information, to technology, the access that our government has to be able to reach us for a number of different reasons, why is it so difficult to register to vote? Why is it so difficult to be a part of this conversation? We feel a little bit by design. That is why there was an attack on voting rights in 2014 and before. So our goal is really to push back hard on some of these attacks on the community and make it as easy as possible to engage our folks, but also couple that with communications strategies. Because no matter what beautiful new technology you build, if it's not penetrating in communities of color, if it's not being used by the most disenfranchised, by those folks, then it's not expanding access and it's not helping. So I think those two things, technology and communications, are at the forefront of everything.
Well, you're not using MySpace anymore, so
No.
You're now using Facebook, but Facebook has its own challenges, as
Yes.
we're reading every day in the paper. Yeah, sorry, the paper. Freudian slip there. In any case, is there some, now that
Sure.
social media is advanced, there's great ways to use it for organizing, but there's also challenges because the enemies are on the same platforms as you are.
Yeah, so that's interesting because immediately after the election, one thing that that was a lot easier for us to explain to funders also was our strategy of digital targeting, where we invest the majority of our work around elections goes into digital targeting, goes into social media marketing. That was very hard to explain before. Now, we can kind of come back and say, you know what the Russians did with Cambridge Analytica, that's what we're doing. Very effective, very effective. So in terms of strategies, it's always staying up to date and really, really, again, working with the community that we serve, our social media managers, a lot of our folks on staff, but also our grassroots teams on the ground. We have around 25 local community college, city, and university chapters. Really, really having these strategies and these new things come from them, giving them access to our social media accounts and having them take over. And there's always something new. You always have to keep innovating. So where maybe a year or two ago, our 4 top platforms were Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, we've completely reevaluated our Snapchat strategy because that's bought up and not, or it's not moving as quickly.
But just out of curiosity, are you on your staff using Signal or WhatsApp?
Yes. So
Encrypting your own communications?
So that, I think internal security is another issue, separate from external. We've actually, over the past years, a few times brought in and talked to different security consultants and folks to ensure, for us internal, it's working with our partners at Google, or because we use Gmail, our partners there, to really ensure every single person on our staff has a 2-step security system, so that in the event that somebody hacks into your account, there's actually a safety already there in place, so that things are secure. We use Slack for non-confidential information, but so also try to make that part of the culture. Security is incredibly important. We work in a field where we're dealing with a lot of people's personal information, and everybody is responsible for that security.
Important.
So creating a culture around
So
it is
you've been at Drum 18 years, so a large part of your constituency wasn't online or knew what a smartphone was or even had a flip phone. Now I would venture to guess 95% of your constituency actually have a smartphone of some sort.
Yeah, I think agreeing with Jessica in terms of there are ways that our communities take on technology. It may not look the same as everybody else, but there are various different ways that people use it. So our members, particularly the adults, they use like WhatsApp a lot because that's the way you connect to family networks or networks from back home, or like those localized networks that are from the same village back home. And so they're like on text lists of like 100 people or like 500 people. And they'll use Facebook a moderate amount. But you talk to our youth members and it's like Facebook is old, we don't use that anymore. And it's like Twitter and like Instagram and Snapchat until very recently. So there's different ways that people use it. And our work has been, how do we also build our own capacities to use those technologies as a way to reach people? But for us, we do recognize that it can't be a substitute. We still have to make phone calls. We still have to go visit people at people's doors. But there are some people who, for example, we have a lot of members who work like 14-hour shifts, and their lives are literally just, they work, they come home, they go to sleep. And so a message on Facebook or a picture on Instagram reaches them much better than trying to figure out that 10-minute window when they will be home and not asleep. So there's different ways in which technology ends up either in direct communication or similarly as like sort of external communications. Yesterday we held funerals for 2 migrant border crossers who died crossing the US-Mexico border. These are 2 Bangladeshi boys, 18 and 21. went to Brazil, walked, hitchhiked their way up to the border, and died crossing the Rio Grande River. We held a funeral, and then today, as we put the pictures out, about 10 members contacted in the 30 minutes between us posting that and me coming here, saying, oh, I'm sorry, I missed this event. How can I help with the fundraising? What are ways that we can continue to support this sort of work and prevent this from happening in the future? So there's ways around using technology to stay in touch with folks and to amplify the existing work. Along the similar lines, there's a second component, particularly relevant for our youth members and in unique ways for some of our adult members, is community-based journalism. So a lot of our youth members have been trained by some of our ally organizations on how to make community-led media. So they'll make videos on different campaigns that we're running, different actions that we're doing. They're trained enough to know how to edit those videos, and they can put them out, which really helps to encapsulate the work and put it out in a way that is easily digestible and helps to promote the work. With our adult members, some of them were formerly journalists. They may be cab drivers here, they may be restaurant workers here, but they were journalists back in their home countries. And so a lot of them kind of do. Facebook Live is very, very popular as a way of sort of live streaming events and figuring out how do you capture stories of what's going on. Anywhere from a action happening locally. Last week we did Know Your Rights training inside of a restaurant on how to build security in case ICE comes or police comes to abuse people, as there have been increasing reports of ICE raids at restaurants. And one of the workers from there broadcast it, and then 20 other workers from the neighborhood said, hey, we want that same training in our own restaurant. So there's ways that technology reaches people that even we may not be connected to. The last issue is less about how we use it, but something that we're concerned around is data. What happens with data that's been collected on our people? Either through technology or even beyond technology. Technology makes the data that you hold a lot more actionable. And so a large part of our membership are people that applied for the DACA program. And the day that DACA was rescinded, the next day, the main question wasn't, oh, I've lost my DACA, what happens now? The main question was, when I applied for DACA, I gave over information about myself and my family. And so they know where we live, they know who my brother is, they know who my mother is, they know who my father is, they may even know where they work. What do we do about that? And so, and this is not an administration to where we can say oh, we can rely on their assurances that they will not use that data to target people. And so a lot of that thinking around data is now leading to the development of a campaign around how do we secure that data, how do we change that from just a recommendation that they can choose to follow or not to follow into actual law that data cannot be used against our communities. And DACA is just kind of one program, but that circle is going to keep expanding more and more.
So we spent a little time before we got on stage to talk a little bit about expanding the idea of what civic engagement means. When you ask most people what civic engagement means in sort of the traditional context, it's voting or jury duty or joining a community board. And I gave an example that in my experience in New York in the last 10 years, the best form of civic engagement that I've seen was Occupy Sandy, where people just spontaneously went out to the Rockaways and other places to help their neighbors with their homes when the government actually didn't have enough capacity to help. And that when we talk about civic engagement and civic innovation in the 21st century, we have an opportunity to expand the idea of civic engagement as something that has more to do with being present in your community and being connected to your community and your neighbors in a way that's meaningful, authentic, and in some ways connected through enhanced through technology, but that goes beyond the way we traditionally think about our democracy and citizen involvement. And so I'd love to have you talk a little bit, since we were talking about social media and we were talking about how people are using new technologies themselves and your organization's using technology. How are you engaging with your own constituencies and their use in a way where we're building with, not for? You're not just responsible, but they are actually, in some ways, actually taking the lead in many directions in either moving the community forward, changing the way your strategies work, responding differently. These are people who aren't just voting with their, or showing up at a protest. They're actually engaged every day. So how is your organization responding to this large community of activity?
All right, so I'll share two examples. One is for many of our members who come from South Asia or the diaspora. They're baffled by the idea that people can't vote in local elections if they're not citizens. Because back home, even if you're a refugee, even if you're an immigrant, at least on local elections, you're allowed to vote in most South Asian countries. And several of our members have been raising those concerns, and DRUM, along with New York Immigration Coalition and many others, have been thinking around what would it take to expand municipal voting rights on a local level. What would it mean if people, by virtue of being residents in New York City, could vote for city council, for the comptroller, for the mayor? And a lot of the sort of building the momentum for that has been through collecting petitions, which is kind of going door by door, which a lot of these members have taken up leadership on, but also using technology to sort of share their stories. So many of our members are also themselves twice removed. We have a lot of Afghan members who were refugees in Pakistan. And so they talk about that they were displaced in this other country, and here's the ways that they were able to civically engage while being refugees in Pakistan. And yet they come here and feel that even those limited opportunities are further limited. And so sharing their stories and encouraging other people from their communities or communities that they're connected to, and being like, all right, like, these are the stories, this is how this impacts us, how do we sort of organize together as communities? Similarly, I mentioned this funeral that was held yesterday. One particular committee in the community, the Noakhali Shomiti, which is the district where the two young men were from, when we first publicized that we found the bodies of these, that we've been contacted, that these two bodies have been found, we need to connect with the families back home. It was actually that committee that publicized it to all of their contacts back home. And within 3 hours, we were able to locate the family in Bangladesh. And then this committee then set up a sort of fundraising drive, raised $15,000 to do the funeral expenses and the transportation for those two bodies. And they will be sent back home late tonight to Bangladesh, back to their families and to their villages. And so there's these ways that our communities are connected to each other, that they are able to use technology, they're able to leverage technology to further the communication. But then there's also our role is to provide opportunities for people based on what they feel, what they need, what they've experienced, to figure out what are ways that they want to step into leadership, what are responsibilities that they want to take. And it's very much organizing with them rather than for them. We could have handled the funeral stuff all on our own, and we would have been less effective at it, and it would be much harder, and it would have taken much longer. But people in the communities are able to have the capacity and are able to do a lot of this work. And it's just around us providing support for them and figuring out how to best create the pathways for leadership for people.
Jessica?
So I'll add on a little bit to what you were talking about in terms of organizing community and building that community. At the end of the day, these technologies and tools and all these forms of communications are tools for organizing. For us, it's digital organizing. Person to person, I think face-to-face, traditionally, absolute best way to engage people in any issue, whether it's immigration or voting. Face-to-face is by far the best way to do it. When that's not scalable across the country, in communities that are hard to reach, in communities that people don't have access to, digital tools like social media, email, SMS are all tools to help make those human connections and create that organizing community. For us, one of the tools that we started using in 2016 was Hustle. So we have a really robust SMS text program email, social media, all these different forms of communication. But peer-to-peer, whether it's a person posting and contacting their social media contacts or emailing their contacts individual is by far the most effective way to get somebody to move on an issue, to vote, to whatever it is that you want them to do. Hustle bypasses SMS texting laws that don't allow you to basically spam individuals on their cell phones, which makes a lot of sense. Everybody, sometimes with an email, you might delete it, you don't necessarily need to look at it, but a text, it's very personal. You get something on your phone and you look at it, whether it's from somebody you know or not. So what it allows us to do is create volunteer groups that mass text one by one our constituents. So we can buy a list of unregistered voters. We can go through our list of contacts. We have about 100,000 people on SMS, but over close to 1 million people across all of our digital platforms. So it allows, all these tools and technologies really allow you to make those peer-to-peer connections and move people on the issues that are important to you.
So we didn't actually talk about this before, but you just reminded me to ask about fundraising. So in your particular case, you have a very large community across the country. So if you ask people to support you financially, you'll receive some. Do you have some idea of what the percentage is between what you get from traditional either grants or giving by large donors versus small donors and small donations?
Sure. So do the math really quick. It's definitely under, it's 5 to 10%. I don't know that exact number, but in terms of our audience, for us right now, it's 5 to 10%, but it's something that we're definitely working on building up, because that's also, I think, a big misconception for communities of color, that they don't give to the causes that they care about, that they don't give financially. But I think it's structured in a different way of giving. I heard this great interview with Oprah and Trevor Noah. I don't know if anybody's a fan, but I love Trevor Noah.
Which one?
Both. But I heard them talking about the black tax and what communities of color face when they are getting ahead in life. There's this huge responsibility to take your family with you, to help your siblings, to help the generations that came before you because of everything that they're sacrificing, because of the hardships, and because of the tight-knit community that a lot of these that a lot of us are in. So it's not formalized. It's not formalized giving. When just anecdotally, my husband and I give money to both of our parents every month. That's not counted anywhere in our tax write-offs or in our giving. It's not officially philanthropic, but communities are very, very generous. Our communities. So finding a way to formalize that and to show that a donation to, whether it's a party, a candidate, a organization, is actually paying back dividends to your larger community, including people in that community, and building that relationship and that trust is a big part of our work and our strategy. But it's also, I think, a way for us to have independence in reacting to issues that are important to that same community.
Well,
I don't know if that answered your question.
Sort of. It keeps us on topic. Do you raise money online? No?
Yes, a little bit, although I would almost copy the example word for word. I would say about 10% come from grassroots donors, including online. There are 85% comes from foundations. Although I think for us, it's a little bit more reflective of us not making the ask as often as we should be or could be. There's some organizations that are very good about it. We tend to do the work first and then kind of be like, oh, we probably should have asked for some money to help do the work.
Yeah. But okay, so let's talk a little bit about capacity, because you both represent organizations that are, let's say, technologically savvy, or at least leaning in to technology as much as possible. And I think we've seen over the last 10 years that the leadership at foundations and other nonprofit organizations, particularly around the arena of social justice, have accepted innovative ideas. Or now, it used to be that a lot of organizations didn't even have a website, didn't have a social media account. Now they do. and they're applying it, but there still seems to be a gap between the funding that's available for technology innovation and the funding that you need for your general operations. And to upgrade and to change your organization into a constantly dynamic organization to keep moving with the technology must be a challenge. So how do you think about that? And have you talked to your own funders about increasing funding specifically for technology to increase your capacity, to protect your data, to analyze your data? Talk a little bit about the challenges of funding innovation.
I can kick off, but I think we have been lucky to where that's always been a big part of our strategy. But I think I heard this example at a talk we were talking a little bit about New America, and heard Cecilia Munoz really, I think, put this together in a really succinct and powerful way. In the 80s, there was a huge push by big foundations and big philanthropy to update organizations, some of the big civil rights organizations, to ensure that they had communications capacity. A lot of them didn't have a press secretary, didn't have a comms department, didn't have a way to get their story and their information out. So made an investment in building communications. For any organization nowadays, I think it's a cost of entry to be able to communicate your message to the masses, to a large audience, to get your information out there. We're at a place where technology is that new communications department. Investing in a CTO, investing in a technology department and experts, I think has the potential to really solve huge problems and allow organizations to think about problems in a different way. Think about them the way that Silicon Valley or startups or businesses do, where having a different approach to solving these problems through technology, through looking at it differently is incredibly important. And I think something that we would love to invest more in and build up more resources for. Because for us, we started with this digital is cheap model. It's not cheap in the long run, right? If you want to make a real difference, if you want to make a real impact, you need to invest in that back end, you need to invest in that technology. I'll give kind of one quick example from 2016. We raised money at the beginning of the year to build up a strong digital program. We're able to end the year with around 177,000 voter registrations for very little money, much less than it would cost to do field voter registrations. We were in Florida around the hurricane when the deadline to register a vote got extended. At that point, the polls were looking good. Don't trust polls anymore, but that was the general consensus. And we went to a funder and said, we have capacity to keep going because our systems are set up, we're online, we can register more voters in Florida. At that point, we were kind of told, no, it's all right, I think we're good in Florida. And it's incredibly painful because what we asked for was enough to register around 200,000 voters, which I really think we could have done, but that was the margin of loss, about the margin of loss in Florida.
It's really depressing me. So how do you think about technology funding, capacity, growth in your relationships to your funders who would either provide you that money or?
Yeah. I think reiterating a little bit of sort of what I mentioned earlier, it's like, how do we sort of do the work and then kind of later on ask the question? So I'm the ED, I'm also generally the go-to tech guy in the organization. We did have lots of funders that were very conscious and in the immediate aftermath of the election did reach out around security concerns. How do we protect our data? How do we sort of tighten up our servers, our email, and have been very forthright in providing resources to make that happen. I think in terms of more proactively, like building out infrastructure, which is really what the issue is about. It's for smaller organizations, it's a harder pitch to make. there's almost this expectation that, oh, you all are small and scrappy, and so you can do things on like little amount of resources, which just means that we work even more harder and or even more overworked than we already are. And I think that continues to remain an issue.
Yeah, at Civic Hall, we often have nonprofit organizations basically come to us and say, we need a techie, but they're not sure what kind of techie they need. They need an app built, or they might need a data scientist, or they need a social media specialist, or they need a cybersecurity specialist. And very often now in the tech community in New York, you'll see technologists who will say, I want to help solve criminal justice problems or help the homeless, but they don't have the knowledge to know exactly how to engage. So we've developed a program where we actually identify nonprofit organizations that are ready, willing, and able to engage with technology. They know what they want. It has a beginning and an end. It's not their entire technology portfolio. It's just a project that would be transformative in some way. And we match them up with teams of technologists that have the specific skills to that need, usually led by a product manager. And we bring them together to the place where they both get a benefit and a meaningful relationship out of it. The project gets completed, we measure the outcomes. And now what's happening is that the technologists are joining the boards of those nonprofits, which helps change the culture. And the nonprofit executives are asking to learn how to code or learning how to data science. But even they can't afford going to a General Assembly and paying $6,000, so there's not enough capacity to even train them. Plus they can't exactly take off 6 months to go learn these. So the upskilling our professional classes is really part of it. And I want us to actually, if we can, I don't know if we can turn our lights in the house up so that we can open this up to the audience, but I want to ask the audience if they could, by a show of hands, how many of you at your organization have a chief technology officer and a chief technology officer? So just a few hands. Please don't be shy. There's nothing wrong with not having a chief technology, having one or not having one. How about a chief data officer? Wow, okay, so just a couple. So, and then of the organizations, I'm assuming most of you are funders, of the organizations you fund, how many of you would say that more than 50% of the organizations you fund have a chief technology officer and a chief data officer?
One hand.
So, we're ready for questions. No, please.
Hi, I'm Pat Jenny from, Pat Jenny from New York Community Trust. First, I want to thank you for this panel. It's been very, very interesting. I also want to thank Jessica and Ahmed and Andrew for the work that you do in the community. It's
Thank you.
Critically important. My question is, you have given us a lot of examples of how technology has accelerated communication, and sometimes to frightening pace. You've also alluded to the shoe leather that is still needed to build communities. And certainly, New York City is a city of immigrants. We have seen many, many different communities come into the city and really create platforms for individuals and families to make a living, create a community, become part of a community, and part of the general American life. I'm wondering, I'm trying to figure out, I'm not a techie, I will say that right up front, but is there a way that technology actually can help make that very long and labor-intensive process of building a community, shaking hands, going door to door, speaking at meetings, going to churches, going to union halls, whatever. Can it make that process more efficient somehow, besides just the communication? Because I think that we've seen the dangers of that kind of rapid, accelerated communications among groups that all of us wish never did talk to each other. So that's the question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I can jump in a little bit. I think there's definitely an advantage, or there's a part of that allows for larger communities to access information. So when you were talking about, bypassing the kind of traditional town halls, or maybe having to be somewhere in person to share information, for us, being able to have digital town halls immediately, we talked a little bit about the rescinding of DACA. Immediately after that happened, we were able to put together a Facebook Live with a partner lawyer, a immigrant rights group, and our team to answer immediate questions that folks had without having to, send out an invite to an in-person event that brings everybody together. I think that's one sort of example, is being able to have events virtually. But for us, it also really streamlined. And it's funny because you talked about, aside from communication, I think that's what it is though, is a way to reach more people and share information more quickly, but also create those relationships more quickly that bring people together as kind of the next step. We have a little bit of a engagement continuum that starts with very passively getting involved online, moves up to kind of harder asks of calling your congressman, committing to pledge to something, signing a petition, and then the last kind of level of that commitment is attending an in-person event or being part of a volunteer activity, something like that. So I think it does help in that way to accelerate people's engagement.
I think similarly, the technology sort of becomes, as a communication tool, you're able to reach a wider audience. And then if you get somebody, then you can create pathways to deeper engagement. But fundamentally, there isn't a substitute for the flesh-to-flesh engagement. It's just that technology serves as a pathway to bring people in. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now in our society as a whole is just the general alienation that we're increasingly feeling with ourselves and with each other. The way that people are able to relate to each other is increasingly starting to break down. And the only way around that is to really kind of rebuild a culture of human relationships, which happens flesh to flesh, blood to blood. Because we're a multi-generational organization, we actually see how the levels of alienation are so much higher amongst our youth members, who are a lot more dependent on technology. The adult members use technology, but it's in addition to their human relationships. For a lot of young people, it's become a substitute. And that's part of the political education and engagement that we're also doing, is around how do we really build deeper relationships with each other on a human level?
One of the challenges for organizations that have been in this field for a really long time is actually letting go and allowing the power to shift to and trusting the community. The build with, not for line is a really, really powerful one, and it's hard to get that culturally to stick at incumbent organizations. And part of it is actually anthropological. It reminds me of the famous quote by Henry Ford, where he asked people if he asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. It's really hard for people to imagine a future they can't actually touch. But this is a quick instructive story of exactly where the culture of the organization has to change. So right after Obama got elected, there was a group of Silicon Valley millionaires, billionaires, who offered to fund converting his list of over 2 million people into an ongoing army of people who would run for office to support his policies and just keep going, to keep the campaign in effect going. This money had to come from separate funding because it's not actually legal for the candidate to actually transfer his email address over to the White House. And in the WikiLeaks emails that got famously broadcast, the Hillary Clinton emails, we found the email, literally, this has been reported and verified, from those billionaires to John Podesta, who then wrote to a gentleman by the name of Paul Tullis, who was the head of the DNC at the time, Obama's choice to run the DNC. And Tullis' response to the idea was, I hate this idea, it will kill the party. And the next thing that happened was David Plouffe wrote an email to the 2 million people asking them to buy t-shirts and hats. And they basically just used that email list as a fundraising mechanism. They did not ask those people to engage. They were not willing to share power. And so it's a real challenge for all of us who've been in this field for a really long time, is how do we actually trust these communities in a way that allows us to give up some of that power so that they feel validated and feel stronger so that they can participate more. We have a question up there.
So a great job of moderating this discussion. Vince Staley here from Media Impact Funders. Andrew, I wonder if you could just give us a vignette of what's happening at Civic Hall. For those of us who didn't raise our hands with a CTO or a data specialist, I know that you have in this gig economy this hub of dynamic people who are doing things in your space. A particular vignette that I recall is the person who came and did the idea for veterans activities in the city.
Yeah, thank you, Vince. I'll try to make this short. So, first of all, if you ever hear anybody refer to the tech industry as Silicon Valley, remind them that's a place. The tech industry is not Silicon Valley. New York has actually a much larger tech community. It's far more diverse. It's far more empathetic. An organization that is on my resume called the New York Tech Alliance has over 60,000 members. There are over 2,000 tech meetups every single month in New York on various topics. And many of them are focused on social good. And so 3 years ago, we opened a space called Civic Hall with the idea that there should be a hub for people who want to use technology for the public interest to be able to come together, to meet each other, to collaborate, and try to support each other's work. And although a lot of it is focused on technology, it's not really about the technology. It's about using technology to achieve a larger goal. So we're a capacity building organization. And just to give you a quick example that Vince mentioned, a woman came to Civic Hall who was a veteran of Afghanistan for 30 months of combat duty. She had this idea there should be a local veterans organization that supports recent veterans because they need housing, they need healthcare, they need jobs, they need training. And their VFWs don't provide anything, and a national organization that's focused on recent veterans is mostly focused on Congress and the VA. She didn't know anybody, but she sat at Civic Hall. She met somebody who taught her how to use Nation Builder, which is a platform for campaigns, which our panelists know about. Somebody else built a website for her. Somebody designed a logo for her. Somebody helped her apply for 501c3 status. She created the New York Veterans Alliance, got 300 veterans to sign up online, paying her dues. Now she has a salary. And then she marched them down to the city council and got the city council to pass a bill with a $3 million budget creating the New York City Department of Veteran Services, which to my surprise did not exist. And de Blasio signed it into law. From the day she walked into Civic Hall to the day that bill was signed was less than 8 months. And now the Department of Veteran Services for New York City is a member of Civic Hall and is holding office hours at Civic Hall. And Kristen Rouse, the founder of the Veterans Alliance, is railing against them every day, telling them what they're doing wrong. So that's just a quick example. But the bigger point isn't Civic Hall. The bigger point is that there is a very, very large empathetic community of technologists in New York that are ready, willing to engage. They don't just want to be asked for donations for campaigns for Congress. They actually want to help. But they need to be asked, and they need to be exposed to you all. So one of the reasons why I'm excited, as depressing as the world may be because of the issues that we face every day, reading the paper, that there's actually a new generation that's rising to respond not only to the challenges that we currently have, but to develop new systems to make the old problems less negative and to create more opportunities for equity in the future. So thank you, Vince. Another question, please, right here.
Yes. Hello, my name is Caitlin Mitchell from Empower, the Emerging Markets Foundation. Jessica, you mentioned, well, both of you actually mentioned the engaging young people in the use of technology and inviting them into and promoting civic engagement. At Empower, we're interested specifically in empowering adolescent girls to do this, to raise their or amplify their voices and do that. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenges and any particularly effective strategies that both of you have used, or your organizations, to engage young people and specifically girls, if you have.
Sure. Do you want to start?
So the majority of our members, adult and youth, are young women, are women. And whenever opportunities for leadership open up or for training open up, we prioritize women and LGBTQ folks for those opportunities. The two challenges that we often encounter, one is the limitations by a continually deteriorating public education system. We have more and more young folks who are graduating high school with lower and lower levels of literacy and skills, who actually just want to be told what to do. We have this unique experience of trying to engage people in a workshop over the summer program, and they're like, you know, struggling through it. And then it's kind of like, we also need people to do some grunt work. Here's some envelopes of stuff, and they're really excited about it. What does that say about our educational system? That if that's how we're training, particularly working class young people, I'm sure that's not the case at the specialized high schools or at the private high schools. The second barrier that we also face is sometimes challenges from families around how does this relate to your education, how will this help you? And oftentimes for immigrant communities, because they don't have the networks that have done these sorts of work, have experienced these sorts of things, oftentimes there isn't the capacity to really understand how much of an opportunity it is.
We have time for one more question.
Can I just add something to that really quick? Just to add onto what you were saying, I think just like the technologists that are all over the country, willing and able and ready to do something, they need to be asked. So I think that's a little bit what you were getting to. These folks don't know sometimes that the opportunities are there. In communities of color, you have a lot less mentorship in general because you have less people at the top that are able to pull up the next generation. So where you have those opportunities to connect people, one quick example, we, in 2010 for our 10th year anniversary in 2014, we launched a campaign called VL Innovators, and it was literally connecting tech experts, companies, and a MacArthur grant to young people of color who had ideas about how to solve issues in their community. Out of that, we got 10 amazing projects and people who, most of them did not have any tech background, did not have any, weren't coders or engineers, but they were problem solvers in their community, starting companies, starting apps, starting technology tools to help their community. One of the biggest one that I'll plug was Mi Mentor, which connected people in the healthcare profession, doctors of color, healthcare professionals of color, with young people who had no idea how to navigate the really complex systems of getting into medical or professional school.
Unfortunately, we got. If you could make it really, really quick.
Yes, Marlene Torres, New York Life. My question is for Jessica. We recently heard a congressional candidate in Florida talk about that Puerto Ricans that have resettled in the US, and in this case Florida, should not be allowed to vote. Can you talk about, it's a good segue question. Yeah. We could then, move on to the next topic. Yeah. Transition, right? Transition. Can you talk a bit about the work that you're doing, particularly with the Puerto Ricans that have relocated to the U.S.?
Sure.
Who are American citizens? Thank you.
Sure. So, little known fact: Puerto Ricans can vote in the U.S. for presidential. So you can't say that. It's a lot of misinformation, right? It's going back to this idea that you really have to. We were talking a little bit backstage about the citizenship question on the census. The problem that we have right now is that when you put out this information, when you put out these fearful tactics, the damage has been done. We're starting at a deficit now for both the census, for voting in Florida. In 2016, we actually had a campaign around called Boricua Elige, around getting the Puerto Rican diaspora to vote on behalf of their family on the island in the US elections. I think now more than ever, I think folks are seeing how crucial that is, how little attention is being given to the huge disaster that happened in Puerto Rico. We're coming up on hurricane season again, and it's only gonna get worse from here. So really focusing on reaching communities where they are in the kind of cultural nuance language that makes the most sense for them, because Latinos across the country, communities of color across the country, they're not the same. So you really need to kind of meet them where they are with the organizers, communicators that can relate to them.
So with that, please thank our panelists.
Thank you, Andrew. Before you all disappear, Andrew, Jessica, and Fahd, thank you so much for leaving us with so much food for thought and for your work every day.